Chapter 36, Madman. You call me villain. Cast the word as you would a stone. Seek to bury under. Scorn of herded. Multitude and yet. Forget my name. I am Empress. Most dread. Savage ruler of. Yet fiercer race. Did you expect meekness of me? You call me villain. Speak it a curse. As if hells were grasping instead of grasped. As if I had knelt. You dare. I am tyrant. Bringer of calamity. Crowned and crowning glory of mine empire. Be fearful now. Tremble for my reach is long. My wrath is great. Patient but unrivaled. Above or below. And I will be triumphant. Extract from the play, I Triumphant, author unknown, banned by decree of the Tower under Terribilis II. Finding Black was easy. According to my legionaries, he'd not left the rooms he'd claimed on the highest level of an abandoned house since we'd had the meeting with Eris. He'd had visitors, though, including Warlock and Juniper. I was mildly surprised to find the moon up in the sky when I started the trek to his quarters, but if I'd slept that long, there was no denying my body had needed it. I'd used my name much, drawn deeper from the well than I ever had before, save perhaps on the night William had given me the scar across my chest. It was kind of ridiculous that Hackram could be back on his feet after taking even worse punishment than me, but orcs were made of sterner stuff than humans. Bigger and harder bones, thicker skin, and even a proportionally larger heart. There was something different about their stomachs too, related to how they ate almost only meat, but I'd never been entirely clear on what acidic humors actually did. I set aside the train of thought, recognizing it for the dissembling it was. It was strange to find no blackguards looming silently by the door, watching everything from behind their helmets. My teacher's personal guard followed him everywhere, but I supposed going through Arcadia might have been a bit much for regular humans. Black had been vague when I'd asked him how he'd managed the trip, though he'd at least confirmed Warlock had not been the one to open the way through the other realm. Likely they'd summoned and coerced one of the Fae, which I'd had no idea was actually possible until now. What they could have threatened it with I did not know, but if there was anyone in the Empire who could put the fear of the gods in a creature like that, it was Black. The stairs were rickety, and I paused when I felt something odd about them, frowning as I used my name sight on the wood. Runes had been traced in some kind of golden sorcery, I saw. Most of the mage tongue was still foreign to me, but I recognized a rune associated with explosions and another with alarms. I sighed. Of course he'd trapped the place. His manor in Ader was the second most heavily warded place in the city, and some of the noble families had accumulated protections on theirs for centuries. Most of the work had been done by Warlock, apparently, but he'd also used ward designs coming from as far as the other side of the Tyrian Sea. The Yantei were famous for their arrays, whether sealing or protective. When they'd landed their punitive army on Prissy shores, back in Triumphant's day, they'd trapped at least a dozen demons in scrolls and carried them home after the war. That seemed like a horrible idea to me, now that I had personal experience with demons, but the Yantei did things differently from Calornians. No nation on our continent would be able to function with both a hero and a villain sharing the highest level of authority, but they seemed to be doing fine. Since Black was disinclined to blow up the stairs under me, I finished the trip up the creaking steps. The door to his room was closed, so I knocked and waited a few heartbeats before opening it. My teacher was seated at a table that had clearly come from somewhere else. It was much nicer compared to the rest of the furnishings, and too large to make up the stairway, with papers splayed all over the surface and a lit-up scrying bowl to his side. Candles were scattered across the room, and the faraway silhouette of the moon shone through the window. As usual, his back was turned to the wall. He signaled for me to come in without turning, listening to the voice coming from the bowl. "Won't settle for anything less than double," Scribe said. It's like negotiating with a dragon, the dark-haired man muttered peevishly. Fine, it'll be a dent in the coffers, but we can afford it. But make it clear the payoff is contingent on them following the itinerary we provided. You will be done, Scribe replied a tad dryly. Without either of them bothering with goodbyes, the scrying light winked out. There was a sad excuse for a chair placed across the table, so I claimed it without a word as I snuck a look at the papers in front of him. The handwriting in most of them was familiar. Juniper's calligraphy was as exemplary as ever, a far cry from my own hasty scribbles. How she managed that with fingers twice as thick as mine remained a mystery. After action reports for 3 Hills and Marchford, if I had to guess. Bribing someone, I asked curiously. In a manner of speaking, he said, Scribe is tying up some loose ends for me. I hummed. Where did you find her anyway? The stories don't say. The plain-faced woman was barely in them at all. That almost amused me, considering how important she was to my teacher's administration of Callow. I suspected Scribe was the reason why he'd never had to set up shop in a single city while stabilizing the country after the conquest. The implication of that was that she single-handedly served as both the head of his spy network and a one-woman bureaucracy for a territory about the same size of the empire. Scribe was not someone to underestimate just because she didn't go around swinging a sword. I'd known that even before Emeh had warned me never to attract her ire. The Free Cities, he said. It was an interesting encounter in many ways. I bet. In the tower, Scribe had implied she would have preferred for Black to take the throne instead of Militia, and that Ranger had shared that preference. I'd glimpsed some of the reasons for Ranger's opinion in my latest dream, but the other woman was still very much a riddle to me. I'd never got the impression that Scribe was all that invested in the Empire itself. Black was the real reason she was here. With Warlock having outright admitted to me, he didn't give a single fuck about Prees as a whole. That made 2 of the Calamities whose only loyalty was to my teacher. Given that Captain's very role was bound to the concept of protecting Black, that painted a dangerous picture. There were 5 major named in the Empire, aside from the Empress, and only one of them was a staunch supporter of Militia. The rest only supported her reign by default, allegiance filtered through the Black Knight and dependent on his position. My teacher was perfectly positioned for a coup. He'd founded the modern Legions of Terror, personally led most of their generals on the field, and crafted their very philosophy. He had the named on his side, and likely most of the army. Any other villain I could think of would have already killed Militia and taken the throne, so why hadn't he? That he was Dooney must have been part of it. A paleskin on the throne would be met with immediate and bitter rebellion by most of the High Lords. I knew he was close to the Empress, so that must have been a factor too, but there must have been more to it. The Black Knight was, ultimately, an icily pragmatic man. I did not believe that even a long-standing friendship would stay his hand if the recipient was in his way. I'd been promised an answer to those questions in a way, and it was time to collect. Phrasing would be important, though. He was a hard man to offend, but just asking by the way, why haven't you murdered one of your closest friends and taken her stuff would have him get all sardonic on me. Something to avoid. His sarcasm tended to be on the savage side. The Empire is not sustainable, I said instead. Blurted out, really, but what I was saying wasn't a surprise to him. He'd left me markers on the path down to that understanding, though he'd refrained from just handing me the knowledge. He'd been right to do that. There would always have been a kernel of doubt if I'd not put it together myself. As usual, the man surprised me with how well he understood how I thought. "Finished the books, have you?" he said. "You are essentially correct as long as the borders of the Empire remain what they were previous to the conquest." "That's just delaying the problem, though," I pointed out. "Eventually, the population of Prees will get too big for Callow to feed, and honestly that's something that boggles my mind. Why does the population keep getting bigger if you can't feed it? Even if tyrants don't do anything to address the problem, starvation by itself should keep the whole thing manageable." Black leaned back in his seat, reaching for a jug of wine I hadn't even noticed and pouring himself a glass. With a silently raised eyebrow, he asked me if I wanted a cup too, and I shrugged. He took it as a yes and placed the full glass in front of me. "Because we have the misfortune of being very, very rich," he said. "As long as the trade lanes to the free cities remain open, we can import large amounts of grain from Asher and Procer." "Procer," I repeated dubiously. "I could buy Asher since they're merchants to the bone, but the Principate feeding the Empire, that's a little dubious." "Through intermediaries," he said. "Most people care little for the philosophical debates of heroes and villains, Catherine. In the end, there is a demand for grain in Pries and a surplus of grain in the Principate. The free cities merely provide the necessary fig leaf for that commerce to not rustle too many feathers." "So you're telling me it is sustainable then?" I frowned. "No, you were correct in your initial thought. On good years, those imports and the field sacrifices allowed us to keep our head barely above the water. Should there ever be a diplomatic incident down south, though, or even if the crops were average instead of bountiful, hunger spread across the empire." "And tyrants just allowed that," I said disbelievingly. "Hells, half of them were mad as well. An emperor is the usual comparison actually, and the other half were idiots, but none of them were above a spot of massacre. Not a single one of them decided to clear out a few cities to make this simpler, or even just restrict childbirth. You already do it to the tribes." Black sipped at his glass. I left mine untouched. "Terribilis, the second one, was in a unique position after he reunited Pries," the dark-haired man said. "His reign was stable, his support in the nobility widespread, and the empire's military strength was at one of its historical high points. 20 years of constant war had brought down the numbers to something easy to manage, and he decided to end the issue forever with magical sterilization and strict familial laws. He had, you see, no Calawan ambitions." The knight put down his glass, the sound of it oddly final. "Within a month of his first decree, he was assassinated," Black finished. "And that's the end of it," I said. "Just because one failed, it's not worth trying." "The second Maleficent came closer," he replied. "She got the Empire involved in the free cities, where we could bleed our surplus on foreign fields. She was too successful. Asher and Procer allied to drive her out. Maleficent did not survive her defeat. Dread Emperor Vile tried it with a magical plague that would kill 2 in 10, only to trigger the war of 13 tyrants and 1. Sanguinara, not to be confused with the Sanguinias, made any and all lawbreaking a capital offense. Overthrown within the year. Bilius, the beast, attempted the dead king's gambit of turning all Prisi into undead, poisoned by his chancellor, before heroes even arrived on the scene." "What are you saying exactly?" "Every single tyrant who tried to dam Prisi population growth was rebelled against, disgraced, or assassinated," he spoke calmly. "And militia still reigned. The implications of that were horrifying. So Pries has been swelling with 20 years of easy food imports. God save us all," I whispered. "Less than you would think," Black replied. "We had 2 major wars before the annexation, which killed a significant portion of people of childbearing age. Legionaries cannot have children while in service, even in logistical posts, unless a permit is granted. Militia instituted a similar policy for the imperial bureaucracy, which also had the effect of limiting aristocratic influence in the ranks, and the peasantry only gets fringe benefits from our access to Calawan fields. But it will swell eventually," I said. "In 10 years or 50, it makes no difference, and when it does, the Empire will need another war. And Calernia would bleed. And Calo would bleed as the land closest to Procer, for there was no doubt the Principate would intervene, even if they weren't the target. Procerans fancied themselves the nation that kept evil at bay, and though they had a nasty tendency to annex their neighbors, there was no denying it was them keeping the chain of hunger and the kingdom of the dead bottled up." "It will if it remains the same empire it currently is," Black agreed softly. I closed my eyes, parsing out what he'd meant by that. The problem was twofold as I saw it. Not enough product and too much demand. Getting more product was just delaying the problem, since the demand would keep growing. Lessening the demand was the only way, but resulted in the toppling of the current regime. "Why," I said, "why has every single tyrant who tried to control population been overthrown? Many could be a bad string of coincidences, but every single one, that's bigger. Pride flickered in the man's eyes. Yes, he said, the right question, why, for years I wondered, was evil by nature inherently self-destructive? The House of Light argues as much. But the House of Light is a Callernian institution, shaped by Callernian struggles. Its perspective is limited. Creation, Catherine, is a thing of patterns and balance. The pattern for Pries is fucking up pretty bad, I pointed out. The pattern for Pries is to grasp, he corrected. The pattern for Callow is to be grasped. And just like that it clicked. For every aspect of conquer, there was an aspect of protect. For every hero, there was a villain. Balance enforced by a pattern. Pries got hungry, and so it invaded Callow. That was their pattern. The Empire failed, but the failure was so catastrophic its population problem was solved for a few decades. Then they got hungry again, and the pattern started over. If Pries managed to get its population under control, it would no longer have the manpower to invade Callow, I said. Balance is broken. Anybody going against that loses, because they're going against the entire pattern of the Empire. Patterns cannot be broken, Black smiled, but they can be transcended. Names themselves can be transitory. The Empire doesn't need the manpower to invade Callow if Callow is part of the Empire, I breathed. Truly part of the Empire, not just a conquered territory. Black and militia, for I could not believe that the dread Empress was not up in this to her neck, had spent decades adjusting the Empire so that it would match that state. A small, permanent professional army, instead of the hordes and mass rituals of old. Prissy ruling Callowan cities, Callowans and Prissy institutions like the Legions of Terror. Focus on common external enemies like the Principate, while slowly and quietly smothering the racism in the bureaucracy to pave the way for integration. Gods, I'd been raised in Laura, and my first instinct in looking for protection from Governor Mazis had not been heroes. It had been the local Legion garrison. And to bind the marriage, a Callowan girl in an old Prissy name. Me. My blood ran cold. This was a plan decades in the making, brilliant and utterly ruthless. My first panicked instinct was to ruin it by any way I could. Could I kill Black here and now? Did he trust me enough that he wouldn't see the strike coming? No, that wouldn't even stop it. Militia would carry on regardless, and there was no touching her. If I stood against the Empire now, I would do it without any of the resources I'd spent the last year accumulating. The 15th would balk at rebellion when I couldn't even give them a reason they'd be happy with. I slowed my heartbeat with a long breath, sharply aware of the pale green eyes studying me. If this worked, what would be the end result? What would happen to Callow? The imperial governorship system made permanent, most likely, and spread even further by the lands that would be confiscated as soon as the current rebellion was over. Too many nobles were participating. There'd be only a handful of baronies left west of the Duchy of Dina. And the duchy itself, I supposed, but that barely counted as Callow. Even under the kingdom, it had been an independent nation, in all but name. On the other hand, the cycle would be done. Over with. No more invasions, no more fire and brimstone coming from the east to lay waste to Callow. The thought of that was horribly, horribly tempting. But none of it came at the cost of killing everything that made Callow what it was. They need me for this, I realized. I was more than a possible replacement for Black, should he die or be put aside. I was, in truth, the keystone to what they were trying to build. The proof of concept it was possible at all. And that meant I had leverage. I rested against the back of the ramshackle chair, feeling my leg twinge in pain. Forcing my hands to stop shaking, I met Black's eyes unflinchingly. Hadn't this been my plan from the beginning? Enter the ranks and influence the institution from the inside. Pries was seeking to change Callow, but Callow could change Pries as well. Already my mind was spinning with half a dozen ways to steer this the way I wanted it to go. The way I needed it to go. I won't just let the Empire swallow Callow whole, I told Black. ignoring the voice in the back of my head that told me that sentence preceded my head rolling on the floor. Then don't, he shrugged. Preserve what you believe should be preserved. Change what you believe needs to be changed. If you judge it necessary to end the governorship system, do so. If you think tributary status for duchies like with Dina will be the most stable option, do so. As long as the right banner flies, as long as we look at the same enemies, I have no objections. And he really didn't, I knew. He could have been lying, but there was a weight in my bones that put paid to that notion. This was a pivot, or something close to it. As long as what Black considered his victory condition was met, he genuinely did not care what the state of Callow was. I don't understand you, I half-cursed, half-admitted. This isn't about being a patriot. You don't really think Preci are better than anyone else hells. Most of the time you act like you set half the people in the wasteland on fire given a good pretext. You do these things like the reforms or keeping fuckers like Mazis in check that look like they're good but they're not really. Tools, you call them, but tools are used to make something. What do you want, Black? Languidly, the green-eyed man finished the last of his wine. Do you know what the most common symbol for the struggle between good and evil is? On Callernia, that is, he specified. A child could have answered that. A shatranj board, I said, the so-called game of the gods. I've always hated that image, he spoke mildly. It implies equality, that equivalent forces are arrayed on both sides of the board. Aren't there, I frowned. Balance, you've said it yourself. And yet, he murmured, good always wins. As if he could feel me about to object, he raised his hand. We don't get real victories, Catherine. Oh, we usurp a throne for a few years, or win a handful of battles. Once in a while, we even win a war and stay on top long enough for people to believe we are unbeatable. His eyes turned hard. Then the heroes come. I'd seen many sides to this man since I had first met him. I'd seen him cold and vicious, on the night he'd made a game of Mazis for my edification. I'd seen his face turn into an emotionless clay mask and humanity slide off his face like droplets on the day he'd spoken to me. Once I'd even seen him shaken when the tower had received a red letter. But the look he had on his face now I had only glimpsed once before, when I'd quoted the Book of All Things on the subject of fate. There was an old, implacable anger to his frame. For the first time in my life, I understood why people called becoming angry getting mad. There was a madness in him now, nearly visible to the eye. That should have scared me, but perhaps there was some of it in me too. Some orphan slip of a girl who believed she could snatch a nation from the jaws of wolves and make it her own. It doesn't matter how flawless the scheme was, how impregnable the fortress or powerful the magical weapon, he said. It always ends with a band of adolescents shouting utter platitudes as they tear it all down. The game is rigged so that we lose every single time. He smiled at me, a dark sardonic thing. Half the world turned into a prop for the glory of the other half. The worst of it, I thought, was that I intimately understood where he was coming from. I still had the image burned into my eyelids of the lone swordsman, effortlessly cutting his way through a full line of my men on his way to me, making a mockery of every skill I'd earned with his, and battering down the strength of my name with the superior might of his own. It had stung when I'd realized how easy that had all been for him. That if Warlock hadn't stepped in, I'd be dead, and all my friends with me. It had felt like he'd been chosen to win before the fight had ever started. Even Hunter, who'd failed to be my equal but had simply refused to go down. All the things that had made heroes heroic when I was a child had become infuriating now. Ah, you've had a taste of it yourself, he murmured. How much worse it must be, coming from a culture that still teaches you can win. We don't even have that, Catherine, the hope of the happy ending. We get to cackle on the way down the cliff, or maybe curse our killer with our last breath. You've read the stories, and stories are the lifeblood of names. Villains aren't powerless, I said. He laughed. Oh, if the heroes deserved their victories against us, I would make my peace with it. But they don't, do they? Your sullen little nemesis gets to swing an angel's feather, while you make do with steel and wiles. That's always the way of it. At the last moment, they're taught a secret spell by a dead man, or your mortal weakness is revealed to them, or they somehow manage to master a power in a day that would take a villain 20 years to own. Gods, I've even heard of choirs stepping in to settle a losing fight. The sheer fucking arrogance of it. The second time I'd ever heard him swear, and it surprised me as much as the last. Teeth bared, he leaned forward. None of it is earned. It is handed to them, and this offends me. And when a villain disliked an aspect of creation, they broke it. As simple as that. Of all the things that being a villain entailed, I had grasped this one the easiest. What that said about me, I preferred not to think about. You asked me what I want, Black said. This once, just this once, I want us to win. The smile across his face was a cutting, vicious thing. To spit in the eyes of the Hashmalim, to trample the pride of all those glorious, righteous princes, to scatter their wizards and make their oracles liars, just to prove that it can be done. There was something his eyes burning like coals and embers. So that 500 years from now, a band of heroes shiver in the dark of night, because they know that no matter how powerful their sword or righteous their cause, there was once a time it wasn't enough, that even victories ordained by the heavens can be broken by the will of men. A heartbeat passed, and then he sagged into his seat, as if the words had drained something. The embers in his eyes cooled. I sat in my rickety chair and thought. A long moment passed. Monster, I finally said. A single word, carrying with it the faint memory of fear and a dark alley. Of a black cloak warming my frame on a cold night. It felt like an offered hand. His lips twitched into something almost a smile. The very worst kind, he replied. A hand clasped. I closed my eyes and wondered whether I just saved my homeland or sold it. I did not get much sleep that night. Book 2, Interlude, Nemesis. I've been told one can only be betrayed by a friend, which is why I constantly surround myself with enemies. Dread Emperor Traitorous. This is a problem, Arzeshel said. Acua stilled her tongue before it could deliver a truly scathing piece of sarcasm. The Prosrin was quite good at his work, but he did have an unfortunate tendency to present obvious truths as if they were a revelation from the gods. The two corpses had not been touched since the picket had brought them into the supply tent, the wounds in their throats and kidneys still bloody, if no longer bleeding. The smell was foul, but this was hardly the first time Eris had ever been in a room with corpses. They'd been a staple of her childhood. They hit the sentinels right before dawn, as far as we can tell, the commander of her mercenaries grunted. Knifed those two and infiltrated the camp. We don't know how far in they got. Foundlings, foul little goblins at work, of that there was no doubt. Chider had warned her that the one named robber had a reputation among her kind, as half-mad even by their standards. Acua had been skeptical that Squire would let him off the leash in the middle of a campaign, but she had been incorrect, evidently. Their last confrontation had radicalized her rival more than expected. The girl took everything so personally, even when she was not meant to. Foundling had committed the cardinal sin of coming to care for her power base on a personal level. It made controlling escalation particularly tricky, though admittedly it also made manipulating her child's play. "Are you certain they're no longer in the camp?" she asked. They were 2 days off Marchford, headed for the very ford the city had been named after. This was the first night some of her men had turned up dead, though there'd been reports of goblins skulking around the edge of her camp before. "I combed through the camp, but goblins can hide in a bare white room if they need to," Arzeshel said. "We'll only know for sure when we're on the march." In this kind of situation, Acua's preferred counter would have been to go on the offensive, but the situation did not allow for that kind of maneuvering. By officially designating her as an auxiliary, the Black Knight had ensured she was bound by the regulations of the Legions of Terror. Any incident between her men and the 15th would end up arbitrated by either a military tribunal, whose members would be chosen by foundling or directly by the squire herself, who'd been granted absolute discretionary authority over the legion by Lord Black. That path ended only with gallows being raised. Even her own personal safety was at stake at the moment, though she already knew how she'd slip out of that particular noose when the time came. No, until they reached her own objective, she'd have to stay on the defensive. Not the optimal stance, but it could have its uses. Allowing Squire to build up her confidence with minor indirect victories would make it easier to blindside her later. Acua could not under any circumstances allow herself to be baited into a direct confrontation. It would be throwing away the last year of work entirely, and it was incredibly unlikely she'd manage to pull wool over the eyes of Lord Black twice in a row. The dark-skinned aristocrat consciously refrained from touching the unmarred skin on her hand, where she'd rammed her own knife a few days ago. She suspected the man had been trying to bait her into something unwise, but she'd known better. He did not have enough to kill her, and anything short of that could be healed in time. The fear she still felt at the way he'd smiled at her would go away in time. No one had ever spoken at her before, and while Lord Black was not in the same league as the Empress, there was a reason any agent who'd been in the same room as Militia had to be disposed of immediately. He still had brought more to bear than any mere Black Knight should. A consequence of his lacking power in other areas, perhaps. "Speak with Chider," she ordered. "She'll help you prepare for goblin raiding tactics." Arzashel nodded, looking away too quickly. He'd been looking at her breasts, most likely. The riding dress she was currently wearing did allow some cleavage to show, and puberty had been kind to her in that regard. Acua was the result of centuries of breeding for looks and magical power, though standards of beauty had admittedly shifted several times over that length of time. That the mercenary desired her was a useful tool of control, though that attraction would have to be carefully managed. Spurned men often did childish things to get even, and she had no intention of ever sharing a bed with the Prosren. She left without a word, mind already moving on to the next situation she had to address before the march west resumed. She had a scrying session scheduled, and the woman she was going to be conversing with was not one she could afford to face while distracted. Her tent had been prepared for the casting, the 24 layers of wards humming against her skin when she entered. Waiting for the warlock to be gone had been common sense, for not even old Wallafite secrets were guarantee that man would not be able to listen in. He'd systematically broken through Wallafite warding schemes during the Civil War, after all, and done so without even resorting to sacrifices. There were still entire cabals of mages in the city who dedicated their days to finding out how he'd accomplished that, though their efforts had not borne fruits in decades. Instead of the bowls of water some mages preferred, the Sahelians of Wolaf had always used mirrors. Having them cast from the same ingot ensured a better and more stable connection than most linked items could manage, an advantage that had once ensured her family's armies could communicate as far as Faraman, while their opponents could manage barely half that distance. That Lord Warlock's introduction of a long-range scrying spell accessible to all had destroyed that comparative advantage, still caused some bitter feelings at home. The round golden mirror, the size of her palm, rested innocently on the table. Acua let out a long breath and felt her mind cool. This was not a name trick but a meditative one, setting aside distractions and allowing her thoughts to flow without emotional bias. The technique had been tortured out of a member of the Watch a few centuries ago and carefully hoarded ever since, never leaving the confines of the ruling line of Wolaf. Eris touched a finger to the polished gold. "Show me not my reflection," she spoke in an ancient Mtethwa dialect, "but the face of your brother." Her touch did not leave a fingerprint. There was no ripple, no uncouth glow. The eyes of her mother simply met hers a heartbeat later. High Lady Taja Sahelian was nearly 60 years old, though she looked barely half of that. It was no glamour. Rituals to maintain the physical trappings of youth and the same superior breeding that had led to both their beauty were more than enough. High cheekbones and perfect eyebrows, lovely dark golden eyes and full lips. It was no mystery why the High Lady still had so many admirers even at her age. "Mother," Acua said. The High Lady would not have spoken first if she hadn't. An unspoken reminder that, for all that Eris had a name, she was still not the dominant partner in their relationship. "Acua," her mother replied, "I'm told you're finally on the march." Likely the woman already knew where they were headed, but Eris answered the unasked question nonetheless. "To Lys," she said. "We've been ordered to take the city while Lord Black deals with the rebel host." The High Lady has no visible reaction, but there was a palpable sense of satisfaction emanating from her nonetheless, even through the mirror. That part of the plan had succeeded flawlessly. "Foundling must be anxious," Mother said. "She will be finishing her pattern of 3 with the hero." Not gloating, for High Lady Tasia was better bred than that, but something close to it. Squire had actually not seemed anything of the sort, though she had to be aware that after a victory and a draw she was headed for a defeat against the lone swordsman. No doubt her teacher had informed her that it was possible to discharge that mandated defeat without the consequences being fatal, though Acua doubted it would easy, with a bard on the opposing side. While those types of names were rarely able to intervene directly, there was nothing stopping them from manipulating the situation from behind the scene. "Is my support on schedule?" Eris asked. She sent for her own reinforcements, detachments of household troops contributed by all the ranking members of the Truebloods. Only 1,000 overall, since none of the members trusted each other enough to truly deplete their strength, but it would still double her numbers. Her mother paused. "There have been developments," she said. Not a collapse of the Trueblood coalition, Eris decided calmly. It was currently the most united it had been since Malicia's ascension of the tower. An exterior factor then. The swordsman. He should have been in lease with the Stygian slaves, but heroes could be slippery that way. Such as. High Lady Tasia allowed her lips to thin in displeasure. "The ships assembled to cross the Wazalidi were stolen," she said. The meditation technique held, muting the sense of surprise. "Not sunk, stolen." That phrasing was not happenstance. "The thief," Eris said. "She left a note on the shore, informing us they had been borrowed indefinitely," Mother said, eyes gone hot with rage. "A small fleet, gone inside an hour without a trace. They're not on the river and our agents in Mercantes have seen no sign of them." Heroes, unmaking a month of preparations as easily as a soldier tossed dice. "You could charter more," Acua noted. Mother shook her head minutely. "The Empress has finally made her move." That single sentence brought fresh dread that put anything personal fear, inflicted by Lord Black, to shame. The man was a threat, but he was ultimately nothing more than an exceedingly talented warlord. Dangerous, but he could be neutered through politics. Her most dreadful Majesty Malicia, first of her name, had always been the most dangerous of the two. While her knights settled the provinces, the Empress had spent decades fencing with the sharpest minds in Pries, leaving behind her a trail of broken ambitions and exquisitely outplayed corpses. She was particularly clever about this one, the High Lady admitted. Our request that the clans be forced to pay the tributes they refused under nefarious rests on the legality that, even when not under de facto imperial control, territories are subject to imperial law and obligations. Under that understanding, the lands you looted in southern Callow are granted the same legal status. Which meant either Wolof had to pay massive reparations for the damages incurred in that territory, or withdraw the request made to the tower. That her mother was currently implying she would not have the funds to assemble another fleet of transports implied she'd already reached a decision on the matter. And we can't rely on the other Truebloods to foot the bill. Mother is the unofficial head of the coalition, but unmatched monetary contributions would muddy that status. Acua found she agreed with the decision made here, after a moment. Wealth would flow back in Sahelian coffers soon enough, while backing down on the Orc issue was not something they could ever take back. It was still incredibly inconvenient. "I'll manage without them," Acua said, to her mother's visible approval. In some ways, having only expendable troops at her disposal opened possibilities. She'd already secured the necessary fuel for her rituals, but being able to operate without the limitation of having to preserve any of her forces, save her personal followers, allowed for a degree of recklessness borrowed household troops would forbid. Not to mention, never having to pay the mercenaries would relieve the family coffers of an additional burden. She could work with this, unplanned as it was. "Keep me informed as you approach Lys," High Lady Taja ordered. Acua bowed her head, though the commanding tone rankled. It always did. Without wasting any times on goodbyes, her mother's profile disappeared from the mirror. Eris waited, for now came the contact she'd actually been looking forward to. The link between mirrors activated again, responding as if it had been triggered from the other side. It hadn't been. A spell had been used that fooled the laws of sympathy scrying relied on to make the artifact believe it was connected to its match again. An older Saninke man appeared on the surface, face wrinkled with laugh lines and sleepless nights. Not particularly handsome, but there was an intensity to him that almost made up for it when he focused entirely on something. "Papa," Acua smiled. "Impanzi," her father grinned. "Dear one." He'd always refused to use the name Mother had given her. One of the few kinds of rebellion he allowed himself. "You look tired, Papa," she frowned. "Have you been working on another project?" "Oh, nothing important," he dismissed. "I may have stumbled onto an improvement on the Shabaz ritual that bears promise. Still a horribly wasteful form of conversion, but it brings foundational flight closer to the sacrificial threshold." Eris found a smile tugging at her lips. Only her father would call modifying a ritual formula dating back to the Declaration nothing important. On another day, she would have asked him to elaborate if only to watch his face light up. Not to mention that if he genuinely found a way to make flying fortresses less costly, it could be very useful. But she had precious little time right now. She loved to talk magic with her father, though, she truly did. He had a real passion for the subject, and as a child he'd made it a pleasure to learn. Acua believed that if he'd not been her teacher, she would not be half the caster she was today, no matter the potential she'd been born to. And she still believed he would have been a much better warlock than the current one, if he'd pressed his claim. So many things could have been different, if Papa had answered the call of the name instead of denied it. "You have that look on your face again, my child," the dark-skinned man sighed. "The one that says you're tugging at doors best left unopened." "I wish you were with me," Acua said. "I wish you had never gone at all," he replied sadly. "You know I had to," Eris said. "I know your mother said that," he murmured. "You do not have to listen to her." "You do," Acua almost said, but it would have been unfair. Her father had been born one of the mostly innately talented mages of his generation, to the extent that he'd had a claim on the name of Warlock after the previous one's assassination. He had not, however, been born to a powerful family. Minor nobility sworn to the High Lord of Aksum, a deeply paranoid man whose only daughter was already married. If he'd stayed in the village of his birth, he'd have been taken in the dark of night and never seen again. High Lords did not allow strong mages to survive if they were not personal retainers or useful breeding stock. Instead, he'd found protection and funding in Wolof, where her mother had required obedience and his help in conceiving a child in exchange. He'd never even been granted official consort status. Their only contact when she'd been a child had been her tutelage in sorcery, all other interactions strictly forbidden. Not that Papa hadn't found a way regardless, running circles around High Lady Taja's best mages and turning it into a game for his infant daughter. She loved him for that and loved him still, for he had never once asked anything of her. All her life she'd been told that the gifts of her birth raised her above others, whether it be in intellect or looks or sorcery, and that girls like her only came once every few hundred years. It had been a heady thing, until she'd realized that those gifts came at a price. She was a product of the oldest blood of Prees, and her loyalty to that blood was expected to be absolute. Acua was to return the banner of evil, real evil, to its rightful place at the summit of the tower. Anything less was unacceptable. And the truth was, she believed in this. She did not know whether or not that was because she had been raised to believe it, but ultimately it didn't matter. No matter the source, the conviction had become her own. Whoring out the soul of the empire for a few victories, the way militia had was repulsive to her. The Empress path was one that looked back on all of what Prees had ever been and dismissed it as the flailing of children. Every villain who'd ever spit in the eye of the heavens swept under the carpet like a shameful blemish, 1,000 years of tears and blood denied. Acua looked back on the tyrants of old and felt only pride, for the monsters and the fools both, for even the fools had shaken the world in their own way. Their legacy was not wrong, it was just incomplete. It had taken years to realize that, for all that her mother preached this gospel, the reality of intentions was different. High Lady Tasia planned for her daughter to be the next Dread Empress, and for herself to be the power behind the throne. Whether or not she ended up being Chancellor was irrelevant, so long as Acua enthroned was utterly dependent on Wallafite resources to maintain her reign. What Eris had thought to be fate was just another, larger cage. You should not have taught me as well as you have, Mother, if you wanted to succeed. I'll win, Papa, Acua said. Believe in me. Always, he smiled softly. I'm just getting old and pansy. We old men like to fret. I love you, Eris murmured, embarrassed. I love you too, her father replied. Nothing will ever change that. If you can believe anything, believe in this. Her hand remained on the mirror, long after his image faded. She wished the spell had been less than perfect, so that the bleed over had warmed the metal for her touch. I'll win, she promised herself. She'd break the cage, even if she had to break the world with it. The olive-skinned old man hopped along the chalk lines traced on the ground, fumbling the last to the children's delight. The gaggle of street kids excitedly started arguing about the kind of penalty Afon would have to submit to. He'd stood perfectly on his hands earlier, to their amazement. The shaved former slave smiled at a fair-haired girl who tugged at his pants, patting her head and promising in all seriousness that he'd show her how to use a spear later. The child scowled ferociously and told him he'd better. All of the Stygian spears were in a constant state of wonder around children William had found. They were made magically sterile during their conditioning, for their masters believed that while sex was a useful reward, their soldier slaves should never have their loyalty split by families of their own. The lone swordsman snorted as the commander of the Stygian phalanx deftly pushed himself up on a single hand, muscles tensing as he maintained the stance perfectly for a solid 60 heartbeats as the kids counted out loud. They seemed to be settling in fine, Almorava said. Of all the heroes he'd worked with, the bard was the only one who'd ever managed to sneak up on him. William's hand dropped from the handle of the penitent's blade, and he turned to look at the Asheran musician. She'd somehow managed to sit at his side without making a single sound or getting the attention of his name, which they were both perfectly aware should be impossible. With a salacious grin, she offered him a pull from the flask of rotgut in her hand. He declined wordlessly, not that it stopped her from polishing off half the stuff inside. You've been gone a lot lately, he said, turning his attention back to the city streets. Lys was beautiful this time of the year, just like he remembered. The city of swans bordered a lake full of the birds it had been named for, the light stone and widespread garlands of flowers hanging from everywhere, making it look like it was in a permanent festival. It was far cry from how it had been when he'd first arrived with Baroness Dormer's host and the Stygians. Lys had been left without a garrison by the rebels and descended almost immediately into chaos, without even a city guard to keep the peace. There'd been riots and looting until he restored order, and the Duke's Plaza had been turned into a makeshift gallows where Prissy sympathizers were lynched to the jeers of the crowd. Not that they even always waited for that parody of justice. More than a few couples mixing Wastelanders and Callowans had been murdered in their own homes, thought thankfully no one had been stupid enough to start a fire afterwards. Half the city would have gone up in flames if they had. Hasn't been much for me to do, Almorava replied, wiping her mouth and panting. She seemed tired and haggard, William noted. Could use a bath, not that she didn't often. In this kind of heat, liquor took its toll. Where do you go, Bard, he asked, when you're not here? You're going to be getting a message soon, the Bard said, ignoring his question. From the first prince. William's lips curled with distaste. His single meeting with the woman had not left him with much trust or fondness for her. It was said that there were 3 kinds of prosrens, the hot-blooded Arlesites in the south, the scheming Alamans in the center, and the coldly practical Lycianese in the north. After meeting the Lycianese first prince, he'd had no trouble believing what was said about her people. She used manners and diplomacy like soldiers used sword and shield, cornering her opponents one smile and polite question at a time. And what does her most serene highness want from me? He asked. Not her, the Bard said. Her cousin the augur, she's seen what's coming. Almorava's tone had remained light, but it raised William's hackles nonetheless. There'd been an ominous weight to that sentence, for all of the heroine's nonchalance. Squire, he said. And the other one, the wandering Bard grinned. You're a hit with the ladies, Willie. Must be your body, because I'm sad to inform you it's not your winning personality. You don't even sound a little bit sad, William complained good-naturedly. Though he'd humored his friend in her bantering, most of his attention was already on the battle ahead of him. With both the Baroness, men, and his Stygian allies, he'd have both numerical superiority and walls. Against most people that would be enough, but he'd met Catherine Foundling before. Uphill battles like this were her specialty. He'd already prepared the city for a siege by bringing in foodstuff from the neighboring fields the moment the Countess Marchford had ordered him to remain and protect the unofficial rebel capital. But it wouldn't be enough. Traditional siege tactics wouldn't be the way his enemy would go at it. He'd have to watch for infiltrators, starting right now, and prepare a counter for the enemy mages. He grimaced. Leading armies or even small groups was not his specialty, as Thief had pointed out a few months ago. I'm thinking of putting Afan in charge of the defense, he told Almorava, gauging her for a reaction. She hummed approvingly. Not a bad idea, she said. The former slave facing his former owner. It has a shape to it. You really think she'll let the heiress participate? He frowned. I thought they were rivals. She won't have a choice, the Bard said, putting down her half-empty bottle and taking out a deck of cards from her bag ever full of surprises. Tarot, he recognized when she flicked a card at him. 6 of Cups. There might have been a meaning to that, though he didn't know it. Are you branching out in divination now? He teased. Divination is just parsing out a story that hasn't been written yet, the Bard snorted. As if I'd need cards to do that. No, I just like throwing those around people who think too much. They waste their time puzzling out the meaning when they should be worried about something else. He carefully picked up the card, holding it up. Illuminate me then, he said. Why does Squire not have a choice in letting her enemy help? By now the big guy already assigned heiress as an auxiliary to the 15th, the Bard said, but that's just a surface detail. Patterns, Willie, it's always about patterns. It will be the final fight between she and I, the lone swordsman frowned. You think she'll be sending an heiress to avoid a defeat, using a proxy, so to speak. The Asheron patted him on the back comfortingly, dropping the deck to pick up her flask. The cards scattered all over the floor, and William repressed a twitch. He disliked messes, and she was making no move to pick any of it up. Close, but you're missing the point, the Bard said. You already have all the information. When referring to heiress earlier, what did you call her? Enemy, William said. Before that, you sorry human-shaped sack of potatoes. I take offense to that kind of, the swordsman replied mildly. Rival, they are rivals. Nemesis even, the bard said, smiling nastily. A heartbeat passed until he caught on. You mean? Yours is not the only pattern of 3 Catherine Foundling is bound by, Almorava said. 1 defeat for Eris on the shores of the Blessed Isle. 1 shared draw in the ruins of Marchford. You know what comes next. A victory in Lease, William finished. Surely she has to be aware of that. Oh, she hasn't noticed, Bard said. As fate would have it, the big guy would have. If he'd arrived in time to hear Eris speak the word draw anyway. But he was detained in Arcadia when getting there. Couldn't find someone to open a way out. A fortnight ago, the dark-haired hero spoke slowly, you appeared covered in snow. Lovely people, the Fae, Almorava mused. Live closer to the story than anybody else. They know better than to ignore the warning of a mysterious cloaked stranger. There was a long moment of silence between them as they watched the children play in the distance. You're a very dangerous woman, Almorava, he finally said. I don't have a speck of power to my name, the bard murmured. All I am is a grain of sand. That can be all it takes to break a machine, William thought. You'd rather Eris survive than Squire, he said after a moment. Every single time, the Asheron agreed vehemently. Foundling is trying to change things for the better at least, the swordsman pointed out, though defending the traitor left a foul taste in his mouth. You need to stop thinking in terms of individuals, William, the bard grunted. The Squire is a legacy, so is Eris. One of those legacies is much more dangerous to creation than the other. She summoned a demon bard, the hero spoke flatly. I'll say this for Malicia and her dogs, they've shown more restraint than their predecessors. It doesn't matter if she summons a whole army, though she didn't do any summoning at all. Eris loses in the end, that's her story. She makes a mess, but in the end she can't win. These practical evil types, they can win if we let them. It wouldn't be the first time evil wins, the hero said grimly. Nor will it be the last if we should be defeated. They don't win like this, William, Almorava said quietly. This monstrosity of a plan the Madman and the Tyrant have cooked up, it changes things, opens a door that can't be closed ever again. They think they're different, but they're not really. Not enough that it matters. Patterns don't discriminate between shades, you see. They only see black and white. You've lost me, the green-eyed man admitted. Don't worry about it, the bard sighed. Just prepare. That plan you've been thinking of, do it. He didn't bother to ask her how she knew about that. The lone swordsman allowed the wandering bard to rest against his shoulder for a while. They stayed like that until the sun began to set, the silence strangely comfortable. Nowhere, William, she whispered, bringing the bottle up to her lips. I go nowhere.